Episode 10 with Teresa Pasquale. Hey everybody, you're listening to the Never Forsaken podcast, looking at the lives of the outcasts, the seekers, the never forsakens, those in or out of the local church, and passionate about Christ. The show is broadcast weekly, and show notes and more information can be found at neverforsakenpodcast.com. I'm your host, John Robinson. Let's get into the show. Thank you, podcast listeners, for joining in to another episode of the Never Forsaken podcast. My guest today is Teresa Pasquale. Teresa is a trauma specialist, contemplative actioner, speaker, and author of the book Sacred Wounds. She's an author with Chalice Press and also the training director at Transform Network. Teresa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, not a problem, Teresa. So this is kind of a mouthful, all of these titles and things that you do. Could you kind of just shed a little light on what exactly, well, we'll start with a contemplative actioner. What does that mean exactly? And what is your work with that pertain to?
Sure. So most of that right now is in the area of activism and advocacy, but specifically around, how do we sit in a posture when we're in action. Around the area of activism and advocacy, so many people that move into that area of practice, and really just like all of us humans, come into our experiences with wounds, with pain. And a lot of times the thing that fuels initially what we're passionate about, particularly when we're creating action in the world to try to disrupt injustice, can come from that pain, that suffering, and the anger fuels that moving forward into action. But oftentimes that kind of fire burns out very quickly, and it burns people out. So my sort of role in action and advocacy, specific to my work with something called Transform Network, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about, is to be able to offer the tools to those people that are acting in the world, being the voice for injustice, to sit in a space that might be different than when they're used to sitting, maybe fueled by that anger, maybe still full of pain and grief. But how do you transition in a way that moves through the pain, that offers people tools to sit in a different space, a contemplative space, a grounded space, when they move out into the world to do action? So it's sort of changing that internal relationship with what is fueling action, activism, advocacy, and really, so it's self-care for the person, but it's also dynamically changing what the activism may look like, or at least what the person is like that's going into the world seeking justice.
Okay, so the work is, you can do work both with individuals and with groups as well, or is it more just individual focused?
Actually, most of it is group work, and then there's some individual components. How I've been applying it to present is more engaging with communities of activism, both faith-based and secular, and trying to offer an understanding of what's going on inside. People are fueled by that pain and are feeling burnt out, and activism in general and advocacy for justice can be a high burnout area anyway. But trying to offer communities the understanding of what's going on the inside of themselves, and sometimes even the community of action itself can become tumultuous from the mutual experience of pain that's kind of ricocheting from one person to the next. So explaining to communities of action that is something that's going on in all of us, and that particularly in that work, it can burn people out, and just beginning to offer them tools like contemplative practices, everything from learning how to breathe in a more relaxed way to learning how to meditate in a very simple, guided fashion so that they can start to see a doorway to a different way of being. And then, of course, that, as you get more in depth, that will become more individualized work. But generally speaking, it's engaging communities and understanding that and starting to practice being in a different way.
That sounds like that's pretty interesting. So, with that, a lot of that work you're saying is with like activism groups and whatnot, and so we include religious groups in this area as well, I assume?
Yes, it's a combination. I mean, where we are right now, where we sit in the world, where there is a lot to be fighting for in terms of justice seeking there are more people and younger people activating for justice, and the context they do it in is really varied, So faith-based within the Christian context, interfaith, communities working together from different faith backgrounds. And then there's a lot of young secular activists who also, in many ways, I do think, and I've heard feedback from people, that they're seeking spiritual resources to sit deeper, but may have been hurt by religion, and so they're trying to do good in the world, but kind of in some way have an absence of some of those tools that they might be able to utilize.
So it's funny that you mentioned about people being hurt by religion. That's one of the topics I like to discuss a lot. It's something that personal interest of mine and having from personal experiences as well. Teresa, why do you suppose that religious experiences often cause so much religious trauma or so much trauma in general, where you would think that something that, religious base is supposed to be peaceful and it's supposed to change the mindset for the better? Yet oftentimes what we see is that people involved in religion or religious groups often experience the most trauma. Would you say that that's true?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the hard part is we're trying to access something divine through human filters, and not just human filters, but after non-standing systems of hierarchy. So when we add humanity, the nature of our own humanity, with a capacity for power, we've seen that in secular forms as well, in politics, in global relations. It often doesn't end well. And so unfortunately what happens to so many people, and again, I wouldn't say it's universally people's experience, but I would say that in many ways, even if it's just feeling hypocrisy from the faith community that we're embedded in, because in many ways we expect divine perfection and we often get things that fall very short because it's run by humans. But for a number of people, and more we see the stories coming out, there's deep hurt, deep wounding, whether it's the extremes of physical and sexual trauma that happen inside the context of faith systems, again, coming out of the fact that those kind of abuses are power-seeking and power and control crimes. And so once you have any system of hierarchy, you're going to have people that are going to seek it and abuse it to hold other people sort of in submission to them. And so then you see the extremes in that of sexual and physical violence. And then there's a whole spectrum of other ways that we're hurt by the places that are supposed to represent God or love or divine wholeness, including negating people for who they are. So that could be, in the racial justice area, and that kind of work that I see is the intergenerational trauma of having been, having there been genocide against one's own people inside the faith system that you belong to, that was propagated by that system, and the hurt and the healing that needs to happen around that, and the still existing, power dynamics and racial dynamics that still play out in religious context. You see that around gender identity, so who you are and how you identify in your gender role, or just being a woman in a faith context that often, at least the more conservative strains, are still very, very male-driven. Or you have people that are negated for being LGBTQ and not fitting what people are defining as wholly right and wholly just based on their own human interpretation of sacred readings.
So to go on the opposite now, because kind of what we've talked about so far is where you have these systems of hierarchy, and whether that be through some type of religious order or gender or racial or sexuality, it seems that a lot of people will think of these wounds as coming from the top down. But I think that the opposite is also true, and that's not something that's talked about a lot. A lot of people will say, well, I've been hurt by my pastor, I was hurt by a priest, and well, do you have experience with the opposite, where you're dealing with ministers and, priests and those that are in leadership that have also, they're feeling the wounds as well from the people that are underneath them, kind of like the buck stops with the pastor and everything kind of gets dumped on them. So do you deal with those type of issues as well?
Absolutely. And I think, the more that we're able to talk about these things from all different vantage points and roles, the easier it's going to be for people in community and individually to heal from their wounds. I would say for people that are pastors and clergy, it's twofold in the sense that they too, working in the system of religion, are often wounded and jaded. Very often some of the most upset are those that are in the system trying to work in that space of divine work and seeing the humanity of the system being reflected back to them and being really hurtful. And then from the other end, as you said, for people in communities of faith or those even outside of it, being sort of in their own way marginalized as being only one type or only one way of being, and being kind of lumped together with those hurts and those abuses. And I think in my book that's coming out October 20th, Secret Wounds, one of the myths I try to debunk is the sort of, I meet a lot of people and I've talked a lot about religious trauma for a while now, for a number of years. And initially when I say it, people will go, "Oh, you mean how Catholic priests perpetrate are all pedophiles?" And that absolutely is not true either. There's a small segment of people in large systems of power that will abuse that power and that will be sexual predators or physical predators.
Right.
But that doesn't make it the norm for the profession. It's just unfortunate that not only is it a prime environment for that to happen for the handful of people that will do it, the smaller percentage that will do it, but then, of course, you have the complicated system of power that does try to kind of protect itself at all costs. So it puts that blame on the whole when you have many priests and pastors who are not those people.
Yeah, it's multifaceted, and unfortunately, it does seem that the minority of issues seems to get kind of, I won't say blown out of proportion, because I think it does need to be exposed and talked about and dealt with, but it isn't the norm in religion, I would say. But you got a lot of people that will, they'll make comments, say on Facebook or whatever, and religion is only good for hurting people. It's not doing any good, and I don't think that that's true.
Right. Well, and that's so hurt people, and so that's a part of the important role of healing for everyone in the context, because that's just creating a reverse binary. The systems that may have hurt them by saying you're not this or you're not that, so you're not good, to reverse and say that all of it altogether is not good is equally untrue.
I agree with that. It's funny you say that hurt people. That was my next little kind of question to you, is that from my own experiences, as well as being like a semi-leader in church, and I've kind of like, quote unquote, come up through the ranks and been like, say, outreach leader for a while, or youth leader, children's leader or whatnot, but still having pastors over me and whatnot, and really being hurt by them, on a regular basis, more of a mental and an emotional and the power trip kind of thing that you talked about, that I found myself very, very easily turning around and hurting those that I was closest to, whether it be my family or the other workers in the ministry. And so this like cycle perpetuates, and I'm always afraid that the people that kind of worked under me turn around and did the same thing. I hope that's not the case, but how do we kind of handle this in the church? What's the best way to approach these kind of issues?
Well, I think it begins with transparency, so the fear and the anger and the hatred build up in silence. So as we begin to unsilence these components, and we begin to speak them out loud and say that they are happening, which calls everyone to a certain new bravery, new courage, because it requires us to, those of us that may be in situations of faith and leadership, it requires us to be courageous enough to say that, I'm not perfect and that I feel hurt. And it requires people in the community or outside of the community to begin to vocalize their hurt. It really is a process, very much like racial reconciliation, but much like the history of reconciliation around racial justice issues. It requires everybody to come to the table and be able to be honest about where they are so that we can heal together.
Yeah, well, it's not easy to be transparent, that's for certain. I mean, in my own experience with, struggling through my faith and oftentimes having strong doubt and confusion and disappointments just with the faith in general. And then, like, I was almost expected to never talk about that. Like, well, don't bring that up because you're going to make other people doubt. You're going to confuse other people. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And these kind of scriptures get thrown at me. And, so for 20 years now, every time I've dealt with doubt and whatnot, it's been my experience to remove myself from situations. So unfortunately, that's been with like leaving a lot of churches and just having nothing to do with church. And that isn't healthy either, I would say.
Right. And I think, and that's such an unhealthy theological stance. There's a lot of unhealthy theology that gets perpetrated on people, and that in itself is abusive, whether people mean it to be or not, passing along unhealthy theology that tells people that the very thing that makes their faith most alive, like questioning. Questioning is the most alive action that we can have in faith. To tell people not to do that, particularly the reason being is because people are afraid of questions. They're afraid of not having absolutes. They're afraid of the system itself falling apart under questions. But the truth is that, the process of faith, if we're not questioning, we're not growing. If we're not asking about things for our own theological growth, let alone those that we're in the midst of or serving, then we're not able to serve in a wholly human way because we're meant to be questioning the things in our context and looking at them new in each new iteration of our life.
Well, Teresa, with all the transparency going on, let's talk about something like social media where everybody's transparent. Everybody's putting their hurt feelings out there and posting their offenses, and this bothers me. And how does all of this access to so many emotions? I mean, you could scroll through Facebook and in a matter of 10 minutes, you're going to deal with, dozens or 100 different hurt feelings and emotions. And so how does that affect our own personal inner life?
I think, it's been interesting because there have been both amazing and catastrophic consequences of people being able to vocalize those hurts publicly in forms like social media. So initially, the idea of being able to speak out loud and not feel alone in our woundedness is a powerful experience. But in the healing process, if we get stuck just in the space of continuing to speak out our wounds, we get stuck in the space of brokenness, and that is really unhealthy for us. And so I would say that social media can galvanize people with that courage to speak their story out loud, but the problem is it doesn't have a manual or an explanation of how staying just in that space of telling that same hurt story is actually doing us more and more harm each and every time that we do it to ourselves and then to the communities that are built around just saying how hurt we are. And again, I think we're in a space of potential and a potential to evolve out of that. I think that it's created places for people to say the things out loud they never thought they could before. But we need to move beyond it as people individually and communally, beyond just the witness space and into the healing space. And I don't hold any blame that people haven't done that transition because nobody's talked about how you do that yet. And so Sacred Wounds is both about explaining some of the stories that epitomize church hurt, but it's also meant to be an entry point for people to begin to see how they might heal out of that space. I've worked in a variety of different trauma contexts, and each one has unique dimensions. And for the most part, there hasn't been much talk, and definitely maybe almost no talk to those people that have been hurt in those virtual spaces about what now, what next. And so I think people just got stuck in talking about the pain because there wasn't an alternative to get out of it. And so I think the next evolution of this process for all of us is to begin to talk about and share and offer practices and stories about the healing process out of that suffering.
I think that's good. It definitely, you start to talk about it. And like you said, the good parts of social media is that, we're able to connect with one another and with other people that maybe we didn't even know were going through the same type of trauma, the same kind of hurts. And then when you connect with some people that do, it's like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. I don't feel so bad here. And, there's some people that are like me. So is that what you talk about in the book? Is it stories? And then in addition to, is how to, or is it one or the other, or is it a combination of both?
So it's a mixture of narrative and education and healing practices. So I weave throughout the book stories from people who have gone through a variety, I wouldn't say all manner, because there's no way to encompass every single version of hurt, but a spectrum of the way that people have been hurt by faith. And those stories kind of move throughout the text. But also the process of going through it is to begin to shed light on the validity of this experience's authentic trauma, what it looks like specifically in religion for this trauma to show up, and the experience of it as distinct to religious hurt, so that people understand in sort of a layman's terms what's happened, not just what is trauma, yes, that first, but what is religious trauma specific. And then beginning to weave in practices that people can start to do on their own or in community to move out of that space of just the story and into the space that is empowering, hopefully empowering people that you can actually change this. And these are the beginning steps to do that.
So let's talk about religious trauma then. You mentioned that. And, I think what I don't want to see, or what I'm afraid is, like, there's this like bandwagon that happens and all of a sudden everybody's jumping on this religious trauma thing. And not to downplay PTSD at all. I'm a former veteran, and a lot of friends that are combat veterans and whatnot, like, that have legit PTSD. And I know it's not just combat related, but you do tend to see a lot of people will also start to attach themselves to that and like, oh, I got PTSD. They've never been had clinical help or whatnot. So I guess, could you talk a little bit about what trauma or PTSD, what it is and what it isn't?
Sure. I think that is important because, many of us can experience trauma, but it doesn't automatically lead to PTSD. So people can have authentic hurt, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have what we would define as a clinical diagnosis of PTSD. I spent, actually, you said you're a veteran. I spent 5 years of my career working with combat vets and survivors of military sexual trauma in the Department of Veterans Affairs. And so that was the building block for me of my professional area of practice. Also, the first book I wrote is called Men Being Broken, and it's my story as a person who experienced trauma, who did go through PTSD, and who was able to come out the other side and find healing, and I no longer have that diagnosis. So I think there are 3 important things for people to understand, is that trauma is an experience that many of us can have, and what is trauma to you is specific to you. So I can't grade what is traumatic to you. Only you can define what that is and what that hurt looks like. And it's really, trauma is anything that hurts us in a deep and profound way that stays with us. And that could be so many different things for so many different people. The second important thing to know is that not everybody that experiences trauma experiences PTSD. The current statistics are, if you had a traumatic experience happen and there's a room of 10 people who all experienced that trauma, only 2 of them, only 20%, would actually acquire post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'd say those stats might be a little low, but it's never everyone that's experienced trauma that automatically becomes PTSD. PTSD is the clinical definition of when what I call trauma gets stuck. So, meaning rather than it hurt, it was painful, but in some way I've been able to move on from it, or it's hurt, it was painful, and I have an inability to move from this space. And what that looks like in people's lives is a sort of increased pulling away from the world, and increased feeling of everything is dangerous and everything will kill me. And really the reason that it feels that way is because when trauma gets stuck, it keeps that trauma response active, the response that helps us survive in danger, So if a gunshot goes off or there's a fire in the room, our heart starts racing and our body starts getting surges of adrenaline so that we can run away from the thing that is dangerous. When we experience trauma and we get PTSD, that survival response gets stuck, which means that it doesn't, flip the switch back off, or we aren't able to flip the switch back off that says, now I'm safe. It just continues to perpetuate that survival feeling that I'm in danger. And so that's the way that people live in the world. And as a result of that, there could be anger, aggression issues. There can be emotional numbing where you just try and kind of shut everything off because the survival response is so overwhelming. There could be exaggerated startle response, which means that everything makes me jittery. I hear a sound and I jump. It can be nightmares. It can be intrusive thoughts and flashbacks. I can't get rid of this story that keeps playing that says I'm not safe. And so really that whole mind, body, spirit experience of I'm still in survival mode is what PTSD is when it gets stuck. But the third important thing that I want people to know is that if you have trauma and you end up acquiring this stuckness, this PTSD out of it, it's not a death sentence. It's not your whole life story. It's not where things end. There's hope and healing. There's potential to, the same way our brain and body gets rewired to get stuck in survival mode, actually proves that it's possible to change the mechanisms of our brain and body, which means that with help, with tools, you can work your way back out of that into a place where you can turn the switch off and be able to say the world is not dangerous all the time.
How do you respond to the people who say that everything you just said is like, that's a bunch of junk, it's a bunch of head knowledge, and really people just need Jesus? Because I'm sure you've encountered that. People say, well, why don't we have to have all these programs and counseling and people have to talk to somebody when, really Jesus is the healer. And I get that. I'm not denying that aspect of it, but like I'm speaking for myself again, as coming from some religious trauma. Like that's just been told to me so many times that, and to me, it doesn't work. So I'm not saying that it's not Jesus' fault. I'm just saying it's like, that whole unsafe place thing that happens to me when I visit a church. 9 times out of 10, it can almost set me in panic mode. But people will say, well, all you need is Jesus. You don't need psychology. You don't need social workers and all that. How do you respond to those kind of comments?
So I would say 2 things. First, it's really hard for Jesus to be the answer to your healing when the people that represented Jesus are the reason that you're hurt. So that's a really hard place to be in because you don't have access to a Jesus that represents love. You only have access to a God that you were told hates you or doesn't like parts of who you are or tells you to just be this way or the way that you are is not okay. So that's not even accessible for most people, at least not initially, who are going through the experience of trauma in a religious context. And I would say the second I would explain, and I don't know if you've ever heard this little story before, but the story of there being a giant flood in the town and the water level is rising and this man has to climb onto his roof so that he can escape the increasing water, but it's still rising, it's rising. And he's praying, please, God, save me from this, save me. And then a motorboat comes along and said, we're here, we're going to rescue you. And he said, no, it's fine, God's going to take care of me, I'm just waiting for God. And a helicopter comes and says, we're going to airlift you out of here, get on the helicopter. And he said, no, I trust in God, and God's coming for me. And so then the man drowns and goes to heaven. And he says to God, what happened? Where were you? I was praying. And God says, I sent you a boat. I sent you a plane. What were you doing?
Right.
So it's that idea that God and Jesus show up in all manner and all forms. They show up as the people in our lives. They show up as the tools for healing. I genuinely believe that the healing that we have accessible in this world all comes from divine origin. So to deny it because it isn't the package that is the way that people assume God needs to show up in our lives is missing the gift that God has offered us to heal from the pain in our lives.
That's pretty powerful. That's a great point. There's a quote that I have here too, and I can't recall if I wrote this down. It was from your book or was off of your blog. I'm not sure if you were quoting the book. And it says, "Rage and hatred can fuel revolution and even reformation, but it cannot get us to transformation. Only a contemplative and healed heart can do that. So we find ourselves time and again in a violent, chaotic, rageful world, and we eventually manifest the same." And I would say that that's so spot on of our society and our world nowadays. So my question for you is, I'm kind of speaking more for the men here, but I know this is very important for women as well. But I want to ask about modern men and the contemplative life, because I think that in this world where we can get so violent, chaotic, and rageful, how can we manifest that contemplative life, or how could we get more of that into our life, I'll say, when it just seems like we're 100 miles an hour, we're going here and there, and everything's coming at us so fast, and we feel we need to respond to every single thing that's said to us, that's everything that's written on Facebook. So I'm asking, how do we get more involved in a contemplative life? What are some practical steps that we could use to do that?
Well, I would say yes. It's so hard to do in the world that we live in, and that the world is fast paced. And again, we come back to social media or just technology. We can access, but we also can be accessed at all times, which makes it really hard to even fathom a contemplative life. And I think one of the things I like to say to people is, contemplation, like everything else, shows up in the way that there are parts of all of our lives that are gateways to contemplation. The idea of contemplation or meditation can be either intimidating to some or seem totally irrelevant to others. But when I meet with people or I talk with clients, everybody has something that brings them a little sense of peace. And so for some, that may be sitting in a room doing an active practice of meditation, which I would still recommend everybody work towards, because I think it's important to find ways in our life to separate from the world, be in it, not of it, and be able to pull back and have those moments of quiet. I also think the way that I talk about contemplative practice is that it's like recharging from the source, So we have all kinds of ways and access points to God, and some of those are community ritual and church, and sometimes it's just the community itself. But it's important for us to also have direct contact with God that isn't petitionary, that isn't just I'm asking for something, but rather I'm just being with you. The same way we would say, husband and wife, if we spent our whole relationship just doing stuff together and then just asking each other for things, it wouldn't be a very healthy relationship. So our relationship of God, of just deepening the intimacy of relationship, is really, I think, what is the great gift of contemplation. And it allows us to do what I call plug into the source. So our cell phone, if it's not plugged in for a certain amount of time, it will die. And the same thing goes for our spiritual life and our connection to God, is if we're doing the go all the time and we don't step back for those moments of intimacy with God, which just means whatever quiets down all that noise enough that helps you connect with God in just a relationship way, we're going to burn out. We're going to run out of energy. Our power is going to, die out. And so we need to create some kind of ritual for that. But what that looks like for people, or what the gateway to the contemplative life, which I think is really a call to all of us to have a contemplative life as much as an active life, may show up in our lives in different ways. So as people talk to me about riding a motorcycle at dawn, and the ability to just be in a space that is quiet for them, that's a version of a meditative practice. I have a friend who loves triathlons, and when she's running and when she's swimming in the ocean as part of that practice, it's a holy experience for her. And so I think we also don't want to diminish things that aren't traditional practices as we would define them, of meditation or sitting in a space doing a certain kind of contemplative prayer or inner quieting. But we want to see how God shows up in quiet spaces in our lives, feed that more, and maybe that will draw us into a deeper want to go into, say, some of the traditional practices like centering prayer or some kind of contemplative prayer practice.
Those are some great tips, Teresa. I think we definitely need more of it in our life. I think every time I try to meditate, I fall asleep though. So I'm
that is deep meditation.
Yeah, I'm working on it. Or I say I'm meditating and I lay down and shut my eyes, and then I wake up, an hour later, and I really just took a nap. But that's all good. Well, Teresa, those are some great tips and some great practical advice. How could people get a hold of you and get a hold of the book Sacred Wounds so they could learn more about this process and learn more about the contemplative life?
Absolutely. So Sacred Wounds is available now for pre-order, although I think they're actually sending them out, copies out already. So if you order it, you'll probably get it very quickly through Amazon.com. So it's Sacred Wounds, A Path to Healing from Spiritual Trauma. And then you can find me. I have my own website, teresapasquale.com. And by email, people can reach me at tbpasquale@gmail.com. I'm also on Facebook as Teresa B. Pasquale. And then on my website, I'm updating fairly regularly as well as on my Facebook page. I'm doing a small book tour that's going to go around to various places in the country. It's still a little bit in formation, so as well as if people are interested in having me come to their area, they can contact me through any forms, email or social media. It's still a little bit in process, so I'll be going around talking about sacred wounds in different parts of the country over the next 6 to 9 months.
Oh, that's super. And Teresa, I'll link all of that information off of neverforsakenpodcast.com. When I get your podcast up, I'll have all the links there too, so people can get that information as well.
Great.
Well, that sounds great. I'm so glad that you had a chance to speak with me today, Teresa. I'm so glad you gave us a lot of information. I think there's a lot there that people can run with, and at least if not start to deal with it, but perhaps even just recognize what's going on in their life, because I think some people don't even know that they're dealing with some trauma. And why am I this way? Why am I angry? Or why am I, always hateful? And perhaps they can maybe take some steps to recognize in their life, and then again take some further steps to actually work on healing.
Absolutely, and that's really what I hope that this book and just these increased dialogues in general can do, is just open a door for people to understand the validity of their pain and trauma, and then begin to just accumulate resources of how they can heal.
That sounds great. Well, Teresa, thank you so much for your time. I thank you for coming on the show today.
All right, thanks so much for having me.
Not a problem. God bless.
To you too.